I've been asked to talk about the Australian perspective in relation to access to finance for small and medium enterprises, and I come from that perspective of the Australian-Asian experience. CPA Australia, of which I'm the president, has done a lot of work in relation to the operation of businesses across the Australian and Asian region, and we've got a fairly sophisticated view and understanding of what's transpiring in those markets. But the Australian perspective is slightly different. We've come from an environment where we've had 22 uninterrupted periods of economic growth, which is basically we're the only developed country in the world to have achieved that. So we're not suffering some of the problems that are being suffered in other parts of the world. So in Australia, what is a bad debt, you might ask? Well, I know that in my case it's when my kids ask me for money and I lend it to them and they tell me they're going to pay it back next week. That's a bad debt. But there's also occasions where the banks write off bad debts and make provisions, etc. And that's because fundamentally they've lent money to businesses, and in this case small businesses, that they shouldn't have lent money to. It's the opposite to the question that we're talking about this morning. We're talking about why businesses can't get finance that they think they deserve, but invariably there are businesses that have been given finance that shouldn't have got it. And invariably there's a number of businesses that think they deserve finance that shouldn't be given the finance. Essentially it's a decision by the bankers in relation to their ability to repay and the security position, and perhaps the bankers have got it right, that a small business can't repay the money or the risk is too great. The premise that small businesses running around needing money and not being able to get money and actually deserving the money is not sound. We really have to, in a vibrant and healthy market, understand that small businesses can't always get the money that they want. The banks often come in for criticism in relation to being too risk averse, and how many times have we heard the story about the entrepreneur that got knocked back by 16 or 17 banks and subsequently went to a loan shark and put a third mortgage on his motorbike and received some seed funding essentially and started a business and turned it into a multi-million-dollar international business, and looks back at that banker or those 17 bankers that rejected him and thinks that had they been more capable, had better foresight, had better understanding about him, they would have lent the money and everyone would have had a happy life and everyone would have shared in the success. But that's the rarity. Those stories are rare. The more common story is the banker that's lent money to a small business that shouldn't have been lent the money and has subsequently made a provision for a bad debt or caused a default to happen or had to act on security. You don't hear those stories that often. You don't get on a plane and listen to the business channels and hear a story of a banker who said, "Oh, in my career I lent some money to someone that had been knocked back by 16 other banks based on what I thought was a good business proposal, what I could see was energy, what I could see was a dream, and I helped turn his dream into reality. But he subsequently couldn't pay that money back and went broke and I had to sell his house." You don't hear those stories. So we have to understand when seeking finance that the banks and financiers are often making decisions not only in the interest of the applicant, but their own interest. And I know in Australia, even as we speak, and it happens regularly, the banks come to criticism for having lent money to applicants without making the necessary inquiries about their ability to repay. There's some issues at the moment where one of the big banks in Australia has lent money to investors to invest in various schemes, and those schemes have failed. So all those investors are now standing out the front of the banks with placards complaining to the bank about the fact that you've lent me the money. So banks are very mindful of that and often come in for a lot of criticism, which is an absolute nuisance when you're dealing in finance for small business, because the banks all of a sudden are looking at you and saying, have you got the security, have you got the ability to repay, and perhaps satisfying themselves as to that, and also satisfying themselves as to your reputation and bona fides, but also going the extra length and mounting a defence for the argument that they may have lent money to someone that they shouldn't have lent money to. So that's an interesting development in life. It's really part of the power of the consumerism and the power of social media, and the fact that the banks can come into some really troubled waters in relation to their reputation by crowds of people who complain that they've been lent money when they shouldn't have been lent money, even though they wanted to be lent money. There's plenty of issues in finance for small business around the mood, essentially. You know, we've been going for a very long time, and in economics and accounting and being in Rome, you realise how long we've been on this earth and how long humans have been involved in endeavours of enterprise. But clearly, the ups and downs and the cyclical natures of our business lives continue to happen. So banks in times of positivity are more flexible with their lending policies and are chasing increased loan books, because if they don't lend you the money, the other bank will lend you the money, and the other bank's share price will go up, the remuneration to all the employees will go up, the dividends to shareholders will go up. Everybody's a winner. So the bank lending the money and taking the bigger risk in the good markets is making the cautious, sensible bank in the good market look a little bit docile, essentially. So there's a real pressure on banks to play the cyclical game and not be too conservative in times of good. But you don't need a PhD in musical chairs to work out that eventually the music stops and all that comes home to roost. But because a lot of businesses are operated on a short-term type view and perspective, that long-term view is gone out the window. There's inevitably the power of pessimism works its way into the market, and in Australia and Asia, the regulators particularly have been sensitised. They're highly sensitive as a result of the GFC. Australia came through the GFC relatively well. We had a fair bit of money in the bank at the time, thank you to the development and the resurgence of the Asian nations and our enormous mineral wealth. And we certainly had got ourselves into a fairly strong fiscal position, but the GFC came and most of those funds were used to buffet us from the effects of the GFC, hence our continued economic growth. But the regulators are affected by what happens in overseas markets and the European market in particular, and the banking changes that happen across the globe. And even though our banking system survived exceptionally well, we're still impacted by the results of the GFC. And overlaying that is the government's sensitivity about another GFC or more dramas. And we're dealing with governments in Australia that have got 3-year terms, and we're dealing with governments that are very reactionary to populist opinion these days, and social media, etc., is also affecting the government's attitude to public policy. They're far too reactive to the immediate issue to hand, and they lose this long-term vision about what's best for the country. So if there's black clouds looming, there's some negativity happening, there's some scandal, the regulators are very quick to basically put the lenders, the financiers, under some sort of psychological pressure to start acting in the way that they think the market should act. And that trickles down into an effect on the supply side for finance for small business. They basically become victim of government pressure on lenders to contract their lending policies. The banks are a fairly powerful lobby in Australia and do stand up to a large degree to government pressure, but at the same time they are susceptible to it. So we can often see those pessimistic times, and they come and go unbelievably. It's amazing how the human mood can go from optimistic to pessimistic. It's the old flight and fear, the bulls and the bears attitude, and all that impinges upon the finance markets for small business. So fundamentally, in Australia and Asia, we're finding that access to finance for business is not a major issue. Clearly, at the edges, as I've mentioned, there's entities that have been given money that shouldn't have been given money, and there's also entities that need finance in order to expand and grow that haven't got the ability to get that finance. In fact, in Australia, I think we're probably one of the pioneers of crowdfunding, Mike, because we established a bank a number of years ago. The government did, in fact, as a lender of last resort almost, where business people that couldn't get access to finance through conventional means and pass the usual conventional banking tests went to this bank, and this bank had a fairly optimistic view of every proposal that was put to it, and lent money to lots of these businesses. And there was basically a crowd outside their door asking for money. It was obviously doomed to failure, and it did in a very spectacular way. But it was certainly pleasing the crowd whilst it was happening. Some other developments in the Australian market are the issue of superannuation funds. We've got, CPA Australia's got exposure right through the globe, obviously, but Australia and into Asia. And in Australia in particular, there's the retirement savings plan, because it's a little bit more further developed. It's basically superannuation. And there's a massive pool of money in that fund that is locked into equity investment and property investment directly, and previously you couldn't really access that for any form of business development or anything. But the government have relaxed some rules around access to superannuation. So small businesses in Australia can now effectively gear superannuation assets. Previously, 20 odd years ago, most people would have had their superannuation with a life office, etc., completely inaccessible, absolutely no control, bar the choice of their portfolio over where the money was invested. But in recent years, there's been a proliferation of what we call self-managed super funds, or mum and dad super funds, where people are withdrawing their money out of the management of the life offices and the big managed funds, and deciding to invest that how they would like to invest that. Obviously, there's strict rules around where you can invest, etc., and it has to be, bona fide investments, etc. It's all very highly regulated. But the government in recent years have said that pool of money that is invested in your self-managed super fund or your mum and dad super fund can be accessed to help acquire business real property. So they're allowing those funds. That was the first step, allowing those funds to be used in the acquisition of business property. And they took that one step further of recent times and have allowed gearing of those properties to actually increase the amount that the super fund can access in order to fund business real property. So a lot of small businesses have seized upon that opportunity and bought freeholds and business investments as a result of the access to superannuation that they otherwise previously didn't have. Clearly, the GFC has had an impact in Australia, our big four banks, which are those four there, they're massive market players, and they're highly regulated, and they basically served us pretty well during the GFC. And there's always the lament that there's no competition between them, but I see that across the globe in relation to supermarkets in the UK and petrol stations in Germany, for argument's sake. There's always that argument, but fundamentally they've served us very well. The other smaller players, obviously they're keeping them honest. CPA Australia have done a lot of work in relation to what's happening in Asia, and we do a big survey every year, and that confirmed again our findings and our view that the Australian financial system is providing adequate funding for most businesses, although it was a little bit more problematic in the Asian markets in particular. As I mentioned, the crowdfunding is also on the government's agenda. They're dealing with it. I'm not sure whether I'm getting old, but I really don't remember a time in my career where I was so confused about what the next 10 years would bring. Clearly the change is just phenomenal. The things that are happening, the disruption to established markets and established methods of operating is really mind-boggling, and crowdfunding is just one of the issues of change that the government are grappling with, and looking over their shoulder to see what the rest of the world are doing and trying to come to some of their own conclusions as well. So we're not at a firm point of view in relation to a firm public policy in relation to crowdfunding, so watch this space. Residential property has grown in value in Australia in recent years, which has also freed up capital, because the banks are therefore happy to lend what used to be 80% of property years ago. Now they'll lend up to about 95%, and because of those changes also in relation to bank lending policies, which allow banks to lend money to businesses based on residential security, that's also freed up money in relation to finance. And clearly the relatively low interest rates, we think they're low. They're not quite as low as European and US and German interest rates, but we're dealing at 4.5–5% interest rates now, which coming from a country that had a number of years ago now, 18 and 19% interest rates, it's heaven for the borrowers. And another final point I'll make in wrapping up is that the banks and financiers are not interested in defaults. They're not interested in calling in security. They're not interested in collection. Their primary focus is your ability to repay. The fallback position is we have sufficient security over your residential property, etc., in order to recover our funds, but they don't want non-performing loans on their books. They don't want defaults. They don't want collections. They don't want to be on the news as the big bad organisations that are throwing people out of their homes. So the ability to repay is the fundamental factor in lending in Australia. And clearly the way the cloud is working and crowdfunding is working, and the deterioration of people's privacy and the more public all the information about our individual lives become, the big data equation all gives the banks and lenders far more information about individuals' reputations. So we can expect to see in a number of years the reputation of individuals playing a much bigger role in the decision-making of financiers as to whether or not they give you money. Previously, you could sort of reinvent yourself and disappear, or forget something that happened 7 years ago when the file went away. But now the reputation follows you, and it's a very detailed reputation. So that's something to watch out for. Now, I'm happy to take questions post this. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, Chris from IFAC, who's done a wonderful job in organising us. Well done, Chris. Thank you. Thanks very much.